Okay, welcome to the first panel. Before I give floor to our speakers, I just wanted to make one short remark. When Professor Neumann was talking, I think we in Belgrade are very aware that Mr. Putin is not the only European leader who shouted his ministers on TV stations. It was really a very good introduction to our discussions here today. And our first panel is entitled Theorizing Memory Security Nexus. In the first panel, we will have 4 speakers and a discussant on various issues related to the role of collective memories in contemporary security policies. The first speaker is Dr. Alexandria Ines. You have her full biography in your folder. I will just read some of the elements from her biography. She's a lecturer in international relations at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And her research interests include global security from a critical standpoint, engaging gender and post-colonial theory to analyze migration, movement, borders, and boundaries as they interact with the state power. And Alexandra's paper that she will read today is entitled the following: The Ontological Security in Cases of Diaspora, Conflict, and Collective Memory of Trauma. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here in Belgrade. I'm going to start off by giving a short personal example because my paper is really driven by a reflective epistemology, and personal experience drove the questions that I ask in this paper. So I'm from a place in the northeast of England, North Tyneside. It's an industrial county close to the Scottish border. And my example comes from an experience I had many times as a child grocery shopping with my mother. So my mother would every Sunday bake Sunday tea, which is a very English thing to do, I think, and she'd send me to go and get various ingredients. And so this example that I'm going to tell, she sent me to pick up some sultanas, and this happened a lot. She liked to put sultanas in the scones for Sunday tea. So I'd bring the sultanas, and like she did every single time, she'd flip them over and read the packaging for the country of origin. And if she saw that these sultanas were from Turkey, she would send me back to change them, and she would be willing to sacrifice the scones for Sunday tea rather than buy sultanas that came from Turkey. And the reason is because my mother's of Greek Cypriot origin, and she grew up in the UK in North Tyneside, yet she felt a very strong commitment and responsibility not to support what she saw as an illegal occupation in northern Cyprus by Turkey, and so this was why she was unwilling to buy Turkish products. And I think this personal example really kind of captures politics that happen in everyday life that can have an impact in some ways on international conflict, and the impact that I'm thinking of is the way that it kind of preserves and reproduces the memory of a conflict or a particular event, and then transfers that memory to ongoing generations. So my paper is about the Cypriot diaspora in the UK, the Greek Cypriot diaspora in particular, and there is a Turkish Cypriot diaspora in the UK as well, which has different narratives of memory of the Cyprus conflict. And so what I sort of argue or explore in this paper is how the reproduction of memory sort of contributes to intractable conflicts, contributes to conflicts that will endure over time. And I situate this in 2 literatures in international relations. The first one is literature in sort of the constitution of state identity and how identity is reproduced over time, and this is tied in with ontological security, so the security of that identity that's held in a biographical identity narrative. And this is drawn on work from scholars in international relations such as Brent Steele's work on ontological security, Ayşe Zarakol as well, and Jennifer Mouritzen and Katerina Kinborn. And so this idea that there's a biographical identity narrative that sort of writes the history and the collective identity, and as Brent Steele observes in his book Ontological Security in International Relations, if this interacts with a particular moment of trauma, this can sort of rupture the biographical identity narrative. And that's the second literature that I draw on theoretically in this paper, which is the literature on memory and trauma in international relations. So in particular, Jenny Edkin's seminal work. So trauma, kind of as it's memorialized and reproduced, can have an impact on state identity. I look at this at the level of a diaspora population. Diasporas are quite interesting because they have a different identity to both the home state and the host state. And I think that the moment of trauma can create a particular rupture or opening in this identity narrative that's then reproduced over time, and this can impact how a state is seen at the international level. So for example, for Cyprus to kind of understand this moment of trauma as happening in 1974, which is a moment I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. You see Cyprus as kind of an occupied and victim state from the perspective of the Greek Cypriot population. And this sort of gives legitimacy to the Republic of Cyprus and kind of absolves the Greek Cypriot responsibility for their participation in the conflict. So that's kind of how trauma works in this sense. So I'll give a brief background to the case of Cyprus. I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with this already. Cyprus was part of the Ottoman Empire until 1878, when it was leased to the UK, and then during World War I, the UK sort of took over administration of the island. And in the 20s and 30s, there was a lot of migration from Cyprus towards the UK, and this is really when the diaspora was established, in London particularly. In the 40s and particularly in the 50s, sort of conflict and ethnic discord in Cyprus had intensified, and there was a strong movement amongst Greek Cypriots for independence from the British Empire and the opportunity to annex, to unify with Greece. The demographics of Cyprus at the time particularly, they've changed a little bit in recent years, was about 80% Greek Cypriot and about 18% Turkish Cypriot. So there was kind of a sizable Turkish Cypriot minority. That, of course, was not in favour of unifying with Greece. And so during these conflict years as well, there was still sustained migration outside of Cyprus towards the UK, and the diaspora in London grew at this time. Also, it should be mentioned during World War I, there was Turkish Cypriot migration outside of Cyprus towards Turkey as well, given that the Ottoman Empire was on kind of the opposing side to the UK during World War I, so this had an impact. So in 1960, Cyprus got independence from the British Empire as a federal republic, so not with the intention of annexing with Greece, but as a separate independent state. Some of the promises of the Greek Cypriot leader Makarios had been to eventually annex with Greece post-independence. And in 1963, there was reason to believe that this was something Makarios was working towards, because he proposed a series of amendments to the Cypriot constitution, and the constitution had really preserved a lot of minority protections for Turkish Cypriots, and these amendments would have eroded those protections quite significantly. And so from 1963 to 1967, there was concern on the part of Turkish Cypriots that Cyprus was going to move towards annexing with Greece, and that their constitutionally protected status would be eroded, would disappear. And many Turkish Cypriots during these years moved into enclaved villages and towns that were specifically Turkish Cypriot. And the two populations, even though this was kind of throughout the geography of the island, ended up separated and divided in separate villages and towns. So the moment of interest for the Greek Cypriot diaspora happened a little bit later in 1974. So the sort of ethnic discord in Cyprus had calmed a little bit towards the end of the 1960s, but in the early 1970s you had this sort of renewed movement towards the objective of annexing with Greece, with a strong nationalist resurgence on the part of Greek Cypriots. In 1974, a Greek Cypriot-led coup, which was really sort of led with the support of the fascist government in Greece at the time, overthrew the Greek Cypriot president and established a Greek nationalist president in his place. As a result, Turkey then moved into Cyprus from the north, and Turkey was named in the Cypriot constitution as a protectorate state along with Greece and along with the UK. So the military action by Turkey was with the objective of protecting the Turkish Cypriot minority in Cyprus. So Turkey moved into Cyprus from the north and eventually ended up occupying about 36% of the Cypriot territory. Now, what I'm interested in the context of kind of the Greek diaspora and how they preserve and reproduce the memory of the conflict, is how this moment of 1974 takes on particular meaning. Because you really saw kind of quite sustained ethnic discord, at least, in Cyprus prior to 1974. However, when you have this sort of moment of military action in Cyprus and the island becoming physically divided, you kind of see a change in how the diaspora population identifies itself. So you move from being kind of a relatively prosperous diaspora made up of voluntary migrants or economic migrants towards the UK to people who sort of self-identify as refugees and exiles. And of course there were people who were refugees during the conflict who then moved to the UK and elsewhere during this time. But what I'm interested in is how it kind of changes the identity of the diaspora population. So in my analysis, I looked at different ways that this sort of memory of 1974 is reproduced, is memorialized, kind of trying to conceive of 1974 as this moment of trauma as it's identified for the Greek Cypriot population. And so I am interested in pursuing this a little bit more deeply in the form of kind of narratives and the politics of the everyday. But in this paper, I've looked at kind of the dominant narratives that come out amongst Greek Cypriot organizations and the Greek Cypriot community in the UK, in London in particular. So this community holds sort of yearly pickets in Trafalgar Square, regular demonstrations outside the Turkish embassy, regular information sessions to give information about the conflict at the Hellenic Centre in London. And the objectives are sort of stated as being these 3 R's, which is the removal of all Turkish troops from the island, the repatriation of what is termed the colonists, and the return of all refugees without any preconditions. So the objective there is really to recreate the pre-1974 identity of the island itself, and this intention is sort of reproduced and kind of lived by the diaspora population. So I looked at particular narratives that are published, one by the Cypriot High Commission in London, which is published on their website, and another one by Lobby for Cyprus, which is an organisation particular to London for the Greek Cypriot diaspora. The first narrative, the Greek Cypriot High Commission, really puts an emphasis on the nationalist aspirations of Turkey in regard to the conflict. So the nationalist aspirations of the Turkish Cypriot political parties with the objective of partitioning the island is really emphasised in this narrative. And there's no mention of the Organisation of Greek Cypriot Fighters, which was the organisation that really struggled for the aspiration to unite with Greece. This doesn't come up at all. And there's no mention of the objective of enosis with Greece, or unification with Greece. So what's interesting here is kind of how the memory is made not just by what is produced in the narrative, not just by what appears, but also by what is held out of the narrative as well. It also kind of illustrates this moment where rather than sort of talking about the 1960s with the proposed amendments to the Constitution, it also declares that it was Turkey that forced Turkish Cypriots into enclaves in order to create the opportunity to move into Cyprus. So there's definitely some information missing in this narrative. The Lobby for Cyprus narrative, interestingly, gives no pre-1974 history, so it kind of positions the conflict as emerging quite suddenly as an invasion or attack on what was otherwise a peaceful democracy. It doesn't give any kind of information about the struggle for independence or the ethnic conflict during the 1960s. Instead, it puts a very strong emphasis on Turkish human rights violations, on colonialism, on the idea of missing persons, and on cultural destruction. So it kind of lists these sort of crimes as it positions it of Turkey, as opposed to giving kind of this historical information about conflict and ethnic discord on the island. Instead, it kind of positions the 1974 invasion as this moment of attack on an otherwise completely peaceful democracy. So I'm going to put this kind of back in the terms of ontological security, and I think the narratives really show the kind of changed identity of the Greek Cypriot diaspora communities that refocuses the identity of the community around this moment of trauma in 1974. Instead of kind of prosperous families or economic migrants and voluntary migrants, you kind of have this reconstituted identity that's occurred from this moment of opening in the narrative to be constituted instead of kind of an exiled population or a refugee identity. And I think that this really changes the link to the homeland for the diaspora, which is quite interesting. So we see this idea that previously the diaspora population had this kind of idea of a cultural link to the homeland, maybe they had family and relatives there. As the shape of the homeland changes because it becomes divided, as the villages in the north that were previously mixed or Greek Cypriot are no longer can be considered Greek Cypriot, then you see this change where the diaspora population kind of maintains the link by adopting this identity as an exiled population. And I think that this is sort of, because it's particular to a diaspora population, it is really strongly passed on intergenerationally, and what we see is really emotion-laden politics, where the idea of trauma in 1974 is passed on from one generation to the next, who then who hears the testimony, who becomes witness to this idea of trauma, and then bears the responsibility for preserving the memory of it and preserving the link to the homeland. And so I argue that where the biographical identity narrative of the diaspora population in particular is opened or ruptured by the 1974 trauma, the narrative then has to be rewritten, and this rewritten narrative is then passed on and reproduced intergenerationally through the community that hears the testimony, that internalizes the identity and the responsibility to preserve it. So I'll stop there, but if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandria, for this thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure that we will have plenty of questions in the Q&A sessions. But before that, I would like to introduce Jelena Subotić, who is going to be our second speaker today on this panel. Jelena is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University. She received her PhD in Political Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, under the mentorship of Michael Barnett, just like Ayşe Zarakol. A little bit of information that is not in the folder. She's also author of Hijacked Justice, Dealing with the Past in the Balkans, published by Cornell University Press, and also translated into Serbian by the Belgrade Center for Human Rights a few years ago. She published extensively in various journals on the topics of Europeanization, post-conflict reconciliation, identity politics, and human rights. Jelena is going to talk about the circulatory power of narratives. Jelena, please.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be home. So I'm going to begin by asking you to consider the following paired narratives. The first one about who is responsible for the wars of Yugoslav succession in the 1990s. This is a narrative in Croatia. Quote, Croatia led a just and legitimate, defensive and liberating, and not aggressive nor occupying war against anyone. Instead, it defended its territory from greater Serbian aggression within internationally recognized borders. The narrative in Serbia is, quote, Serbia has never in its history been the instigator of any wars. Serbia was always on the side of light and freedom, and never on the wrong side, end quote. Or another paired narrative, this time on the Croatian military Operation Storm in 1995. The narrative in Croatia says, quote, because of Operation Storm, our nation realized its historic right to freedom, and the Republic of Croatia realized fundamental preconditions for peaceful reintegration of the remaining occupied territories, therefore achieving its territorial unity and full sovereignty, end quote. Operation Storm in the Serbian narrative, quote, Operation Storm was the biggest war crime after the Second World War, end quote. Now, my purpose in this paper is not to deconstruct these narratives or adjudicate their respective truthfulness. In fact, I do not care much if either narrative is observably true. Instead, I want to explore how these narratives came to influence one another and how without one, the other has no counterpart to build on. And further, I'm interested in how these narratives themselves become agents of change, how they become social facts, which then influence policy. So I want to think about reconceptualizing these narratives as themselves creating power. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to use what Peter Katzenstein has coined circulatory power and add a new dimension to our discussion of power. What is it? Where can we find it? How does it spread? How does it manifest itself in political life? So let me begin by talking a little bit about why am I interested in narratives and what I think narratives can do for our understanding of a variety of policies, including contemporary security policy. Narratives are important because they give all of us a sense of space and a sense of place. All individuals build their own autobiographies by classifying particular events in our past as successes or failures, as critical junctures or what-if moments, as strokes of good luck or strokes of misfortune. And just like individuals need a sense of autobiography, so too groups need a particular narrative, a compelling story, or where did we come from as a group? How did we come to be who we are? What brings us together in a group? What purpose, what aspirations does our group have? So having this secure autobiography or a firm grasp on our past and our history then provides a sense of stability. It allows us to move forward. So these fundamental stories then become ontological narratives. They help us function as social actors. They structure the image of the self. They create a worldview where collective interests then come from. But narratives can also be mobilizational. In other words, they can be created to establish and promote very specific collective values and also encourage a sense of groupness and a sense of solidarity. They're embedded in everyday discourse, they're embedded in dialogue, in rhetoric, and they exist in a mutually contested relationship. But most significantly for the argument that I'm trying to make today, narratives establish the foundation of not only what once was, but for what ought to be in the future. So they're fundamentally normative in nature. They carry a particular desire for social order and a particular set of social practices and policies. They redefine how historical events are represented. They fix their meaning in place. And then that meaning shapes the parameters and scope of the present. It defines a menu of choices that states can select from. It determines a state's understanding of its place and its purpose in the international system, and also provides cognitive models for decisions that are appropriate and decisions that are not. So they create opportunities for action, as well as certain taboos that make certain action unimaginable. So narratives can yield power. That, I think, is clear. But can we use conceptual narratives to represent power itself? So what can a focus on narratives tell us about power that we did not know before? And here I think the concept of circulatory power can give us some analytical purchase. And again, to build on what Alexandria was talking about, it is precisely at times of great change and great stress and uncertainty that new narratives are created and old ones can become deactivated. And these are the times when circulatory power is most readily observed. So when I talk about circulatory power, what I think about is how we can follow the process by which narratives that I understand as stories with a particular plot, a particular set of characters, and a particular set of events, how they diffuse through time and through space by fueling counter-narratives with the opposing plot and the opposing set of characters and the opposing set of events. The story then spins out of clear institutional and structural political control and instead becomes dispersed. It becomes stronger with time, it feeds itself from opposing narratives, and it finds life in various sectors of society, in art, in history, in popular culture, in education. So these narratives bounce off each other. In many ways, they do not exist without each other. They need to refute one another. They need to build on the denial of the other to succeed. This is how narratives exert this particular circulatory power. So let me now move on and illustrate what I'm interested in with some preliminary thoughts about examples of competing political narratives in the former Yugoslavia. Especially, I'm interested in discussing the circulatory power of the genocide narrative and the ways in which the stories of past horrors, who committed genocide, who were the perpetrators, who were the victims, and how this trauma of the past should be avenged, how they formed the discursive foundation for political acts during the wars of Yugoslav succession in the 1990s, as well as in their aftermath, and as well as they continue today. So why did I choose genocide? Any story of genocide, which is the crime of all crimes, is likely to produce very powerful emotions, very contested narratives, and very conflicted political memories. Genocide is the ultimate crime. It's the totalizing crime. It captures the public imagination like no other mass atrocity. And the fact that its legal definition is very narrow doesn't matter. Genocide in the public sphere, in the public discourse, means very many different things to very many different groups. And the power of the term does not lie in its legal precision, but in its imaginable horror and its existential insecurity. And it's precisely because this term is popularly used to describe a variety of traumatic events. That's why it has so much political purchase. And the genocide narrative feeds on counter-narrative. For every story of genocide, there is a story of genocide denial and the trauma that this denial further perpetuates. The bigger the atrocity, the more significant is the attempt to refute it. And this is why the genocide narrative serves as a good illustration of the concept of circulatory power. The genocide narrative is a social actor itself. It sets parameters of political action. It makes certain action possible, others unimaginable. It sets boundaries for political actors, some lines they cannot cross, some deeply embedded collective memories they cannot change and they cannot challenge. And in that sense, it constitutes actors' identities. It creates identities of genocide victims and identities of genocide perpetrators, which then impact how social actors view the world and what political decisions they make when they act out of these identities. So the genocide narrative lurks in the dark, as you were. It comes up when it is needed, then it disappears again, only to resurface when it's once more politically useful. Now, obviously, in the former Yugoslavia, the genocide narrative has had and continues to have tremendous political power. Much of the brutality of the wars of the 1990s has been justified by political elites as response to existential threat of a new cycle of genocide. So at that level of discourse, the rhetorical use of the term genocide was very important. It was a very powerful symbol, a discursive trigger of sorts, a political cue that conveyed not only imminent existential threat, but also the necessity of a very swift and subsequently very violent response if the group is to survive. So let me give you some, among many others, examples of what genocide was, the term genocide was used to signify throughout the last 20 years in the former Yugoslavia. At various times throughout the 20th century even, the genocide narrative was invoked to discursively justify, for example, the genocide in Srebrenica as Serbian revenge against Muslim conquest of the Serbs 600 years ago, or to justify oppression of Kosovo Albanians as a response to Albanian high birth rates, which were talked to as demographic genocide of Serbs in the 1980s and 1990s, or internationally to invoke NATO intervention in 1999 as prevention of imminent Serbian genocide of Albanians in Kosovo, or the opposite side, to accuse NATO of committing its own genocide in the name of genocide prevention, which Mitropolit Amfilohije said this year, or to warn of new Albanian genocide against Serbs in the aftermath of Kosovo's independence, which Serbian President Nikolic said 2 years ago, or for the Bosniak elites in Bosnia to argue for the unification of Bosnia and abolishment of Republika Srpska, which is a genocidal creation, which Silajdžić and many others said. My point is that genocide in the former Yugoslavia clearly means very different things to different actors, and it has infinite political uses. But since much of the destruction of the former Yugoslavia and the unleashing of violence and mass atrocity stems from the competing Serbian and Croatian 20th century nationalisms, the historical memory and the political activation of the fascist genocide during World War II, for me, was the most promising start. Specifically, I was interested in three things. How the genocide of World War II has been politically activated for three uses in Serbia and Croatia. One, to promote nationalist mobilization through the construction of the victim and perpetrator identity matrix. Two, for continuing genocide denial. and 3, for disciplining dissent. And it has also been firmly institutionalized and legalized and legislated institutionally in both countries. In both Serbia and Croatia, narrative entrepreneurs built a seamless story connecting the events of World War II to those of the War of the 1990s, making the recent war seem historically predetermined and inevitable. The past very swiftly became the present. The conflict became an ahistorical constant. And the contemporary war of the 1990s simply then became the most recent iteration of a timeless national struggle for survival. The story of genocide and the incessant retelling of the story, each time in more gruesome, more fantastical ways, then became an undisputed social fact that guided all political action. It absolved political actors from actual choices. It presented them as simple bystanders of the already predetermined set of events. It recreated their identity as a purely national one, and in so doing, it limited and guided their political choices. So in both Serbia and Croatia, the World War II genocide narrative has established as a fact the idea that Serbs and Croats as peoples were victims of genocide and never its perpetrators. And this claim that victims of genocide cannot possibly also be its perpetrators was directly put to use on numerous occasions in, for example, Serbian official denials of the genocide of Bosniak men by Serbian forces in Srebrenica. And the denial of Serb-committed genocide continues to be very politically important for Bosnian Serb elites in their fight to keep Republika Srpska in Bosnia autonomous and not integrated with the rest of the Bosnian state. For example, the Prime Minister of Republika Srpska Dodik on numerous occasions activated the genocide trope when he argued that Republika Srpska needs to survive as a safe haven for the Serbian people so that atrocities like those of World War II are not repeated. At the same time, Dodik argued that since Serbs fought on the side of the Allies and not the Nazis and Ustasha in World War II, they could not be genocidal people guilty of genocide in Srebrenica. This establishment of proper victimhood identity was very clearly important for the political success of the nationalist project in the 1990s. So, for example, in 1992, at the height of the Croatian War, Serbian government established the Museum of Genocide, which, quote, was a museum of victims of crimes against the Serbian people committed in the independent state of Croatia to inform the public of unprecedented suffering of the Serbian people in the state of the Croatian Nazis, end quote. The political use of the genocide narrative in the 1990s, however, had two additional purposes. It was meant to rev up public sentiment against the Croats at the time of the Croatian War, but also to portray the Serbs as the principal victims of the genocide, thus conveniently absolving them from their own complicity in the Holocaust of Serbian Jews in the early years of the German occupation during World War II. And this omission of any discussion of official Serbian involvement in the Holocaust of Serbian Jews continues to be, in my opinion, the most scandalous aspect of contemporary history education in Serbia. In fact, the Holocaust remembrance itself has been instrumentalized in multiple ways to fit very neatly with the narrative of Serbian suffering, as well as Serbian benevolence toward other nations, such as the Jews. The belief that Serbia has no history of anti-Semitism and that everyday Serbs rush to help their suffering Jewish neighbors during World War II is so heavily ingrained in Serbian national consciousness that it has become a social fact. For example, the authors of one contemporary, still in use, Serbian history textbook publicly took offense at a proposal that textbooks be rewritten to include a full and accurate account of the Holocaust of Jews in Serbia, and they accused the proposed revision of devoting, quote, too much attention to the suffering of Jews in relation to the suffering of other Balkan nations during German occupation, as it is well documented that Jews died mainly in Central Europe and not in the Balkans, end quote. So this instrumentalized memory of the Holocaust in Serbia has become a form of screen memory, to quote Lea David in our audience, that filters out and obfuscates any serious addressing of Serbian responsibility for mass atrocity in more recent wars. And finally, the circulatory power of the genocide narrative served another disciplining function. Since the genocide narrative asserts a genocidal intent to exterminate all members of the nation, This includes even those members of the nation who were against nationalism, war, or those who were opposed to the regime. But since genocide is a totalizing project, even these opposing voices are drowned in the national story. They cannot be excluded from the body politic, because the struggle, even if they're unwilling participants in it, includes them too. The genocide narrative therefore automatically disciplines dissenting voices, because the conflict no longer revolves around politics or resources, but about the existential security of every member of the nation without exception. An exit from this totalizing interpretation of the existential threat is very hard and very rare, which explains why the opposition to nationalism at the time was on the far margins of the polity in both Serbia and Croatia. So let me conclude by wrapping up what the purpose of this whole drama is. I wanted to enrich our understanding of power by reconceptualizing political narratives as representations of circulatory power. And I wanted to use the context and illustrations from the multiple ways in which narratives of genocide in the former Yugoslavia were intertwined, contradictory, but also mutually necessary. And I wanted to demonstrate how political narratives are not only representations of social order, but how they themselves are a form of power that constructs this discursive social order. Narratives change, they shape identities of social actors, they give meaning to their actions, and they create discursive space in which some social actions make sense and others become unimaginable. So when we reconfigure them as forms of circulatory power, we can trace ways in which narratives bounce around the social and political space. They gain momentum from competing narratives. They fight for their own discursive space, and ultimately they shape political choices that actors make. So this renewed focus on narratives as circulatory power can help us identify the processes by which actors make the decisions that they do in the absence of direct control, direct coercion, or institutional structure. Narratives then may be much more subtle, but they're no less real. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. In our introductory speech, we heard that Russia is not a great power any longer. Now we've heard that the Serbs had something to do with the extermination of the Jews. I wonder how will this end? And I hope that we have good security.
I did my part.
Okay, next up is Urban Jakša. Urban holds a BA in International Relations, an MA in Political Theory from the University of Ljubljana, and he began his PhD in geopolitics at the University of York in October 2013. Urban has already a very rich research experience. He studied and conducted research on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in 2010, and he served as an editor-in-chief of the IAPSS journal Politikon, and published numerous articles in Slovenian and English on various subjects related to international politics. Urban's speech is entitled Transactive Memory as an Agent of Heterotemporality in Security Discourse. Urban, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Filip, and for the invitation. Very glad to be here, to be part of this extraordinary event. In my article, I try to address the question of how the construction of collective memory influences the creation of pluralistic security discourse based on multiple nonlinear narratives. I drew on the work of Maurice Halfbachs and his understanding of collective memory, and particularly on one of its core components, transactive memory, by which members of a group often specialize in different areas of remembrance. This specialization is crucial to community building within the security sector and is today facilitated by the use of social networks, the new media, and ICTs. By this, imagined communities in the security sector are constructed, and new media and social networks play the same role as printing technique or transportation played in early modern nation building, according to Benedict Anderson. In my article, I try to forward the claim that the security discourse, as practiced within security institutions, such as the military, the intelligence services, or the police force, is composed of distinct and often contradictory narratives, which function in different temporal categories, or chronotypes, a concept which will be discussed further, and that this heterotemporality is in turn the product of transactive memory as conscious practice of specialized remembrance. Now, the understanding of memory depends on our understanding of time. If we swear by the Kantian understanding of time as a container of succeeding events, then we can also view memory as a storage house or as a storage capacity for past events. But I will suggest that the Kantian understanding of time is insufficient for the complex understanding of memories. And I will offer Henry Bergson's distinction between habit memory and pure memory as an alternative. Bergson speaks of habit memory as a memory that does not correspond fully to the past. It's a memory that is automatic, that is subconscious, and that uses the past for the purposes of present. It allows us to tackle everyday obstacles, to solve easy problems, but prevents us from solving complex riddles. On the other hand, pure memory is an adequate representation of the past. It sort of can be understood as a series of mental snapshots or image remembrance, and it is a true form of memory as opposed to habit memory. Although, for a second, in security communities, habit memory tends to be the predominant type, and thinking often assumes the forms of dichotomies, with the friend-foe dichotomy being the most important one. Habit memory, on one hand, encourages tunnel vision and path dependency of a security discourse and opposes the creation of a pluralistic discourse. On the other hand, it is instrumental in security community building. Now, Maurice Halsbach's concept of collective memory helps us to understand how past events and processes influence our thinking in the present. Halsbach challenges the perception of memories as passive, unchanging, and belonging to an individual. Rather, he suggests that there is another layer below or above the individual memory. This is the collective memory, which is socially constructed in a group. It can be transferred, it can be shared, utilized, and also instrumentalized. It is also useful to consider the definition of collective memory in relation to power, such as the one developed by Whedon and Jordan. They see collective memory as, and I quote, narratives of past experience constituted by and on behalf of specific groups within which they find meaningful forms of identification that may empower, end of quote. Through shared representations, collective memory strengthens the bonds within the group, while at the same time empowers the group vis-à-vis other individuals or groups which are included from this memory sharing process. Transactive memory is, or can be understood as, division of labor applied to memory and remembrance, if I'm allowed to use this political economy metaphor. Just as labor and its fruits are divided unequally, the same is true for memory. Political power also works through memory distribution and transactions, from colonial strategies of imposed forgetting of one's freedom and culture, to capitalist strategies of developing a regulated habit memory that can be applied to carry out tasks, but which exclude pure memory as a locus for critical and emancipatory thought. The division of labor on the level of the nation-state has been instrumental in increased productivity and creation of modern societies, as observed by Adam Smith and Emil Durkheim respectively. Just as the war is becoming, these days is becoming network-centric, Community building in the security sector also depends more and more on global horizontal exchanges through new media and social networks rather than national vertical dissemination through press and television, as it was in the case of nation building. These exchanges are constructing security cultures based on shared values and practices that can be institutionalized into security communities. Due to this development, security narratives can change, as Jelena mentioned before and defined them very well, and do change, and security discourse as practiced within security institutions is composed of distinct and often contradictory narratives. Now, I will try to draw on critical geopolitics and critical security studies to deconstruct time as a uniform and linear category, maintaining time-space as the reference concept. I will also try to draw on the work of Mikhail Bakhtin and his concept of chronotype. He never really provided a clear and concise definition of the concept. Nevertheless, it is possible to provisionally define it as a particular configuration of space-time as expressed in a certain discourse. The concept of chronotype chronotype bridges the divide between the world of narration and the world being narrated, therefore constituting the habitus in which space, time, and power come together and constitute the de facto locum of the security discourse. Lawson sums up the relationship between power relations and narratives in these words, I quote, "The interplay of multiple real-world chronotypes is a critical determinant of how encounters and conflicts unfold in the real world, as mediated by the agents involved both in the encounters or conflicts and in storytelling," end of quote. Since Bakhtin developed the concept of chronotype for analyzing ancient Greek literary genre, it is important to emphasize that ancient Greeks distinguished between two forms of temporality, chronos and kairos. Chronos is the more well-known one. It can be translated as sort of the quantitative clock time. The other is much more difficult to define. Rather than as a separate time vector, kairos is the notion of the transformation of chronos itself. It can be understood as a sort of a time lapse or a qualitative change in the quantitative, to which Hegel comes close with his idea of a leap from quantitative to qualitative. Hutchins gives the example of the Cold War as international politics frozen in time, trapped in a specific chronic form, or chronotype, if you will. The fall of the Berlin Wall, for instance, can also be considered as an intervention of kairos into chronos, a moment of break, of rupture, or a shift, not unlike Badiou's event, for instance. In this context, politics can be defined as the art of manipulating kairos, so chiropolitics, if you will. Security communities engage in a sort of chiropolitics or even chiro warfare, in which dromology, a concept coined by Paul Virilio, the logic of speed and power takes centerpiece. From focus on developing small, mobile, quickly dispatchable rapid response forces to creating ever faster jets and projectiles. Dune and Willer identified two traditional security discourses, realism and pluralism. Realism is basically a discourse on national security, whereas pluralism is a discourse on international security. Critical theory, critical security studies sort of criticize both approaches. The realist approach for taking too many things for granted, but also, interestingly enough, they criticize pluralism with the methodology of realists. They argue that that rules fail to stop political violence, that norms and regulations actually don't work or work only if the states are willing to oblige and respect them out of their interests. And the normative practices of the society of states leave untouched the structural causes of the economic and social injustice rooted in the deregulated capitalist world system. Just as capitalism did not completely substitute previous modes of production, but rather established an overarching network in which they were integrated, heterotemporality does not substitute one form of temporality with another, but constitutes a network in which they can be integrated. The most notable examples, and here I come to a more relevant part for today's analysis of world affairs, the most notable examples of heterotemporality can be seen in contemporary hybrid warfare. If we take the ongoing military conflict in Ukraine as an example, we can see that Russia uses a variety of tools coming from different chronotypes. While the Russian propaganda targeted at a Russian-speaking minority in eastern Ukraine reflects Anderson's imagined community and Hobsbawm's invention of tradition, keeping firmly to the modern nationalist tradition, the information war waged against the West is much more similar to Soviet Union's discourse during the Cold War. Finally, the combined use of intelligence, special forces, or as they have become known these days as the Little Green Man, and cyber warfare to destabilize eastern Ukraine is fundamentally postmodern. European Union and NATO clearly have problems responding to such eclectic and, in their view, confusing strategy. Another prominent example of hybrid warfare based on combining different chronotypes can be found in Iraq and Syria, where the IS, the Islamic State, gained a lot of territory very quickly through combining contemporary warfare, information warfare, and network-centered warfare, and medieval tactics, brutal torture and execution techniques. The contrast with jihadism of the Taliban could not be any greater. While the Taliban were mostly rural and uneducated people from tribal areas, IS is increasingly becoming an internationalized organization with thousands of foreign fighters with Western education and in its ranks. The caliphate distinguishes itself by the use of social networks and contemporary ICTs. They issue glossy reports, viral videos, and so on. The work of the organization is clearly based on very different and even conflicting narratives and chronotypes. Their deeply conservative vision anticipates a return to the golden age of Islam through the establishment of the caliphate and implementation of the Sharia law. The influx of Western fighters fighting for an establishment of an Islamic state in the Middle East is practically imperialist and, in my view, deeply colonialist. Even if they claim to be against Western values, the fact of coming from Western Europe and trying to establish a state and impose social rules and norms to a population that has been living there not just for centuries but millennia is deeply colonialist. In both theaters, Ukrainian and Middle Eastern, we can observe how transactive memory has played a crucial role in task specialization associated with different chronotypes. In Ukraine, specialization in different areas of remembrance has brought into existence a network of 19th century style nationalist leaders, Eurasianist ideologues, Soviet-era intelligence service cadres, and post-Soviet mercenaries, each group embedded in its own chronotype, but working with other groups to achieve a common goal. Finally, perhaps the best indication of security discourse becoming more plural is the fact that online tools and social media platforms, blogs, Facebook, Twitter, allow security practitioners to post their own thoughts and perspectives, often challenging the ones conveyed by mainstream media and necessitating perception management on the part of the government. In the last part of the article, I tried to add more meat to the conceptual skeleton by providing examples of recent security practices in furthering the claim that there is evidence of increasing presence of heterotemporality within security narratives, which, in a context of increasingly network-centric warfare, I believe is instrumental in making of pluralistic security discourses. Thank you.
Thank you, Urban, for this sophisticated theoretical analysis. And I think your paper really shows the importance and the relevance of our understanding of time for the understanding of security, because traditionally security studies have been too much focused on space and geography and geopolitics, and now we have an analysis that is deepened with a sophisticated understanding of time, which is, I think, welcomed contribution. Next up on our panel is Dr. Hans Mouritzen, who is a senior research fellow at the Danish Institute for International Studies, where he is an editor of the Danish Foreign Policy Yearbook. His constellation theory, emphasizing the spatial and historical dimension of international politics, was relaunched in the co-edited The Geopolitics of Euro-Atlantic Integration, published by Routledge in 2007. Hans Mouritzen has been researching the topic of the importance of foreign policy analogies for quite some time, and he's going to share with us some of the insights in his presentation entitled "Why Lessons of the Past Normally Fail in Contemporary Foreign Policy." Please.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here, Filip. So this is about memory that I'm going to talk, but specifically about how memory is exploited and used in contemporary foreign policy. So, and I shouldn't say used, I should say misused, actually. You say in an introduction to this panel, you say something that memory can be used and misused, but I would say it's always misused, actually, by politicians. Otherwise, they wouldn't be politicians if it wasn't misused. Of course, it can be misused more or less, obviously. So foreign policy decision makers use sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the so-called lessons of the past, of a certain past event. It can be like, for instance, as explained by Alexandria, it can be the Cyprus 1974, or it can be narratives as Jelena mentioned, but it can be genocide narratives, but it's something very specific in time and space. Often something very dramatic. And from this is deduced a kind of imperative: do this or don't do that. It can be both positive or negative. And these studies of memory has been done in political psychology, and they have been done in constructivist IR mainly. My interest is mainly in the end stage, so to speak, in how they are used in contemporary foreign policy, in competition with other contemporary factors. So it's the interplay for me that is the most interesting thing. And often you see that these lessons of the past are used in ambiguous, when the contemporary situation is ambiguous. You don't really know what's happening. Then you have an extra incentive to go to history and, what does this look like? What does this situation look like? And I would say that the thesis of what I'm going to argue here is simply that when you use these, or again misuse these historical lessons, your foreign policy is mostly going to fail. Of course, you may be lucky. There's such a thing as luck in foreign policy. You may be lucky and succeed, but I will argue that will be more the exception than the normal thing to happen. And why is that so? I should say first, before I argue that, I should say first that the main examples that I'm sure you are all familiar with, the main example of a historical lesson is labeled Munich. And Munich, as you know, is the 1938 conference in Munich, where Hitler was given parts of Czechoslovakia, and he was that was seen as the hate of appeasement policy, which Chamberlain and Daladier were responsible of. And in the post-war, after the Second World War, this Munich has been kind of, it has been used so much in different situations. For instance, when in 1956 the Suez conflict, when it was said that Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian leader, he was a new Hitler, and he had authored a book that was just like Mein Kampf, by the way, and he had done other things that resembled Hitler. But then, as the Suez conflict unfolded, everyone could see that he wasn't actually a Hitler in any way. But he was a clever politician who could use scarce resources for his own ends. But he didn't have unlimited ambitions. So my first point, or my first argument why the use of such analogy normally fails, that is simply that a so-called analogy is most often, it's not sufficiently similar. And you could mention Nasser as one example, and another one is Saddam Hussein in connection with the Iraq war of intervention of 2003, where it was said, oh, we have to stop Saddam because he has unlimited powers, and he can attack London or even Washington tomorrow, and terrible things may happen if we don't make this intervention. And well, it again, I mean, Saddam was no Hitler. He may have had his ambitions, but he didn't have Germany's capacities in any way. Well, actually, the few would argue today that the intervention was in any way a success. But it was legitimized in this way. So what I'm talking about here, and what we are talking about here, is very much about legitimization in official discourse. But it may also be that politicians believe this themselves. I don't know if they always believe it, but sometimes they may believe this themselves. They may believe in this historical analogy. So that was my first argument about things being not sufficiently similar. It has also been made by the famous historian Ernest May, who actually launched the concept of lessons of the past many years ago. Another argument is that if you just have an obsession with one particular historical situation, you are likely to fail. It's better that if you have two or more. And especially if these two are in conflicting, give conflicting advice. And as an example, I could mention the Cuban Missile Conflict in 1962, where Kennedy had just studied the book by Barbara Tuchman about the Guns of August, which is a book about the outbreak of World War I. And he had, by studying this book, he had got the impression of the danger of power escalation. Most of his advisors had another analogy. His military advisors and others had the analogy that of Munich that I just mentioned to you. And of course, the Munich analogy would say, oh, we should teach the Soviets a lesson. Whereas Kennedy's analogy said that, oh, we should be careful. Be careful. And these two analogies, as you can see, they competed. They gave competing advice, and that made for a quite successful decision-making procedure. And we did not get a nuclear war, as you may know. So anyway, this is just an example that it's better that you have two or more conflicting analogies than if you just have you just have an obsession with one particular situation. But politicians mostly have only one situation. Also because they have to explain it to their public in their official discourse. You cannot in official discourse, you cannot mention 7 or 8 analogies, of course. And you have to take an analogy which people are familiar with. They have to have some knowledge of it in advance in order to be that it can be effective. And that means that you always, often as a politician, you take the easiest analogy, which is not really good. A subtype of historical analogies is when you are somehow thankful to another state, or you have a certain vindictiveness. Of course, it's better to be thankful than to be vindictive. Thankfulness is not a good thing either, because it's so difficult to measure. For instance, Denmark, in relation to the United States, we are so thankful that they helped us during World War II. So we keep going on military interventions with the US. I don't know for how many times we are going to continue with that, but I mean, this thankfulness is, it would be nice if you could somehow measure it, or if you could measure how much we should have on our bank account in Washington. So it's a slippery concept, which is likely to lead to a failed foreign policy, because other concerns are not given priority. But even worse than thankfulness, of course, is vindictiveness. And when you have a certain version of the past that that makes you vindictive to your neighbor, typically, and then it will turn out that this neighbor will make another version of the same events, and that we have heard about this by Jelena here, with Serbian and Croat versions of the same events. So it's just to say that vindictiveness has a very big conflict potential in it when you begin telling that kind of narratives. And so even more, if a specifically dangerous thing for a decision-making process is when your memory, your narrative is somehow reinforcing the contemporary situation. So there are no checks and balances. For instance, when the Baltic countries joined NATO, they had a contemporary incentive, which was that they wanted some deterrence in relation to Russia. Maybe legitimate, maybe. But they also had their historic lesson, which was that, Russia is somehow the empire of evil. It has always been, and it will always continue to be. And there may be good reasons for having that opinion, of course. But when you have these two things together, both the contemporary view and the historical view, then you get simply they reinforce each other. All domestic actors have the same opinion. They compete who can be the most extreme. As I said, no checks and balances, and you get what you could call societal groupthink. Everybody thinks the same and support each other in thinking that way. Finally, and I'm about to finish. Finally, you could say that the very fact that historical analogies are used in discourse is a sign that something controversial is going on. As a political leader, you have a lack of arguments for going to war, or whatever you are going to do. You know this is controversial. So the very lack of good arguments means that you go to history, or you go to your own interpretation of history, actually. So the implication of what I'm saying, I should say that this argument that it always will fail is, there may be exceptions to this. There is such a thing as luck. There's such a thing as luck in foreign policy. You may be lucky, although you haven't deserved it in any way. But the policy implications of what I'm saying here is simply that saying to public opinion, saying to journalists and others that you should be attentive and you should be suspicious when politicians start talking about that they have learned something from the past that we should now remember, and that we should now, in this serious situation that we are now, we should remember a certain lesson of the past. You should always be suspicious when you hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mouritzen, for demonstrating why historical analogies always or almost always fail. But I would wonder, can we do without them? Can we make the sense of the world without making historical analogies and make our decisions on pure rationality? But I think also that it is interesting to see how different analogies play into the current crisis in Ukraine. If we make an analogy with the First World War, then we may end up in a Guns of August type of precautiousness. If we make an analogy with Munich or with Anschluss, that will definitely lead to escalation. And I hope the former prevails in decision makers' mind. Now, please bear with us. I know that this has been a very long panel together with introductory speech. We have one last contributor who will be a discussant on this panel. Her name is Ayşe Zarakol. She's a lecturer in international politics at the Cambridge University. She also published numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals on ontological security, English school, including her latest book, After Defeat, for Cambridge University Press, which I warmly recommend. And Ayşe will, in the next 10 minutes or so, discuss at least 3 papers that she received and maybe also the oral presentation of Mr. Mouritzen. Please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to speak a bit generally about memory studies and narrative in international relations. I was trained myself in the United States, and it may surprise you in the audience to hear that if you study international relations in the United States, it's possible to spend years and never encounter any writing or analysis about memory or history or narratives. For American IR, these things do not matter. And this is a consequence of how the United States, as a great power, as a current hegemon, operates. It very much lives in the present. Apart from certain historical analogies that they invoke, and often wrongly, like Vietnam or World War II appeasement, there are very few even historical reference in American foreign policy thinking. I myself saw discussions in the State Department where officers are reminded that people from other countries care about history and memories as if it needs to be mentioned, but they are cautioned about this. And there is an implication that it's almost slightly pathetic, right, to be dwelling in the past or in memories. And this, I think, seeps into American academia, and to the extent that American academia and American approaches to IR crowd out other approaches, it has also shaped international relations as a discipline worldwide. Now, recently, as this discipline is becoming more pluralist, as European voices, East European voices, but also people who study places like China, India, and other places like Russia can come to be heard. There has been a growing interest in memory and narratives and identity. I mention this because for those of you in the audience, it may be somewhat obvious. My work is, for instance, on status, international status, and when I go to Turkey and tell people I'm trying to make the case that countries care about status, they look at me as if, well, of course they do. I mean, this is obvious. This is what you make a career of. But some of these things, some of these points have to be made over and over again in a discipline that tends to really downplay these factors. Now, so the papers here are very welcome in this regard in terms of going against the grain of the mainstream. But that also means, I think, because the discipline has evolved in this particular presentist form, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in theorizing how different aspects of memory and identity relate to each other. So I will say a few things about each paper in a moment. But let me also tie that to, reading Alexandria's paper about her mother's personal protest about Turkish sultanas. We all have many experiences like this. So the example that I want to use is yesterday, as I was entering Belgrade, I have two passports, a Turkish passport and an American passport. So I was thinking to myself, should I enter with my Turkish passport or should I enter with my American passport? Which one would get me better reception? And I think this is the one country where it was a really, usually it's very obvious which one it will be. But here I was like, does the border guard care more about the old Kosovo War or the new Kosovo War? And then at the end, I answered with my American passport. I decided that that was the better call. But anyway, so I want to mention this because even in that in that moment, right, like Alexandria's mother, there are negotiations that are made. I made a negotiation myself, about an interaction, and even breaking that very small interaction that at the end of the day amounted to nothing. You can start thinking about the way memory matters. So if we're talking, the most recent Kosovo War is in lived experience. If the passport guard officer, she was young. I think at most she was a baby, but her family would have recollections of this. So it's a lived experience. Whereas the old Kosovo War, right? It's many centuries apart. It's not a lived experience. It's past or received memory, but somehow it still matters. And in my calculation, it perhaps matters more. But I'd like to see in the papers as all of you go forward, some thinking about are all memories the same, right? Do we care more about past events that are in the past, or do we care more about events that were part of our own lived experience? And I don't know that the answer is so obvious. So historians, for instance, make distinction between cultural memory, which has no horizon. They're almost timeless or invoke a sense of timelessness, whereas communicative memory, which focuses on recent events, and it has a short horizon, at most maybe 80 years or so. And also the relationship between, again, going back to the encounter with the passport guard, the relationship between the individual and the collective. Does it make a difference how in the role that the collective memory plays? Does it make a difference whether we have actually lived as individuals through that event ourselves, or are we, to some extent, always shaped by the collective narrative? Historians debate this, and I think the current trend in oral history is to really discount the individual experience and argue that individuals remember and experience certain historical or political events just as part of the collective narrative. But it's again, we really have to think through these issues. And Alexandria, again, going back to your paper, I really enjoyed it. I think it's really interesting to study how diasporas remember certain events. But I think there needs to be, because the state is absent, right, from the diaspora. You don't have the state writing textbooks, reproducing the narrative over and over again. You really need to think through how are these narratives, how are these memories created and reproduced? Is your mother acting a certain way because she made an individual decision given her experience of that event, or is this an idea she got from her church? I mean, or her diaspora, a Cypriot, I don't know, cultural club. So we have to think through what are the institutions that produce and reproduce these memories. And I would like to see, if we're talking about memories holding collectives together, what was it before 1974 that shaped the diaspora community? Because there was a diaspora community, so if it wasn't this trauma, what was it holding it together? And then another interesting question, I think, is, of course, 1974 is a very traumatic event, but I don't think when we're studying memories and how people remember them, we should assume the conclusion. I mean, it seems traumatic now because that's the narrative that's come to dominate. We can find, I think, if we look at history, similar events that didn't cause traumas or cause traumas in quite the same way. So as the events were unfolding, that was an open question, but somehow the perception that it was very traumatic and it is the most important and the most defining event came to be hegemonic in the discourse. So why was that? And yeah, I don't think it should be necessarily assumed that it was going to unfold that way. So those are, I think, some places to begin, and it would help, I think, to engage with historians of memory and oral history, that Urban's paper quotes, and also this is for Jelena as well. There's been some studies theorizing these links. And Jelena, with your paper, the question that I had is, you talk about the circulatory power of narratives, but so it's not clear to me. You do say at some points throughout the paper that the narratives are social agents, they have power. So it's almost as if, and I don't know if you're attempting to do this, and it may be fine, that you're giving agency to the narrative themselves. So is that what you're trying to do? Anyway, I'm not going to, we can talk about that later. It has certain issues, giving agency to non-agents, obviously, the narratives. And even if the narratives themselves have power, who else derives from power from those narratives? One thing that came to mind as you were talking about the competing or the complementary genocide narratives is, given the fact that genocide is a modern term and a term that is received from the international community, I had the feeling, comparing these narratives, that somehow these communities were playing to an external audience or the imaginary gaze of the international community, that they were trying to convince some imaginary person out there that no, they genocided, no, they genocided, so why is that? Why do you agree that there is this imaginary gaze, and why does it matter? I think that may be another avenue. And one thing I thought about reading both Alexandria and Jelena's accounts, why is it that some communities get fixated on victimhood narratives? Or maybe the more interesting question is, why is it that some communities don't? But why does the collectivity hold? Does it have to hold around trauma or victimhood? And if collective narratives and memories really need this sense of being wronged in order to cohere together, then does it mean, and I don't suggest this as a Turkish person, but does it mean that the people who are wronging the community are in fact doing the community some kind of service, giving them some kind of identity to cohere around. I mean, I don't know that you necessarily want to engage these questions directly, but I think, you know, the study of memory raises up all these issues that would be fruitful to think about. Coming to Urban, again, very helpful thinking through of different literatures on history and you know, time, as Philip said. What would I think take the paper to a new level is if you can link that theoretical discussion with a more in-depth empirical analysis, because the way you were talking about security communities, pluralism of security communities, I thought you were going to do an analysis of foreign policy thinking and how, in order to do successful foreign policy these days, you have to understand, tropes and symbols from different times and ages and so on. But at the end of your paper, you switch and you focus on what's happening in Ukraine, you focus on what's happening in ISIS, and it's almost as if the actors out in the world are drawing from different chronotypes and not the analysts. So are you interested in the fragmentation of time, which some would argue is, post-modernity, the fact that we are drawing from all these research. So is that what you're interested in, or are you interested in foreign policy thinking? And I'd like you to think more about how do we know something is medieval? I mean, if it's happening now, if it's being deliberately pulled, if beheading is being chosen deliberately as a strategy to invoke medievalism, is it really medieval, or is it actually something that's very modern, to use beheading in that way or as a spectacle to attract attention and so on? So how do we know what belongs to what time? I think is not a very easy question to answer. And for Hans, I agree, with my short exposure to foreign policy world, I agree with you completely that use of historical analogies is entirely problematic, not just in Denmark, but everywhere. But how can we, improve this? Is it that we, put a ban on politicians using historical analogy and say, we won't listen to you if you start talking about history? Do we come up with more historical analogies? Do we study new examples, give them new case studies to be abused? I mean, you identify the problem, but what is the response to this other than to say, politicians will be politicians, it's too bad. So I'd like to hear more about a solution. So thank you.
Thank you, Ayşe, for your intervention, and I would like to ask the speakers to hold their breath for a second. We have a little bit more time, although we are out of time officially, but it would be great to hear the audience as well, and I would like to pick maybe 3 questions, and then we can respond to what Ayşe said. Any gentleman in the back, please?
Dan Guzina, I have a question for Jelena. Listening to your presentation...
Microphone, sorry.
Okay. Okay, this is the question for Jelena. I hope that you can hear me now. Listening to your presentations, I kind of reminded me of one American movie, Groundhog Day, but your interpretation is more like a horror interpretation of that movie. As you all know, the guy constantly wakes up and has to repeat his rather mediocre life until finally he gets it right. Now, what do Serbs and Croats need to do to wake up and finally actually leave this circular power of competing narratives?
Thank you. Professor Neumann?
I have a comment to...
Can you please wait for me?
I have a comment to the question asked by... I actually have a possible answer to the question asked by Ayşe Zarakol. What is more important, the old stuff or the stuff you lived yourself? And we have a colleague, Benjamin de Carvalho, who wrote a paper on Vietnamese war films. And his key point was that the war films were the place, the locus, actually the kairos, which means opportunity after all, where Americans had a chance to remember the Vietnam Wars And the key thing about them was that the Vietnamese were nowhere to be seen. The films centered on Americans. Right? And as he was going to a conference in the US to present this paper, he was stopped he was stopped by the border officer and asked, "So what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I'm presenting this paper to a conference." And the border guard said, "What is it on?" And he said, "It's about Vietnam." And the border guard said, "Well, that's interesting. I was fighting in Vietnam. Have you seen Coming Home? That's exactly what it was like." So I think we have one possible answer to the question of what is more important, your own experiences or the social. I'd say in many cases, the social. How could it be otherwise? How could an event from 1389, to pick a date totally at random, be so important for so many people living their lives?
Thank you. Let's take one more question. Gentleman in the back.
Hello, Maria Zurnic. I'm a researcher in politics. I'd like to ask Jelena Subotić. You mentioned in your presentation that narratives can trigger some events, they can shape them, they can even legitimize the action. So I wonder what's your position theoretically and empirically about the aspect of causality between political discourse and political action, and whether you empirically studied it on these case studies, if you're concerned with this issue in your research. Thank you.
Thank you. Any volunteers would like to start? Alexandria, please.
And thank you actually very much for those comments. They're very, very helpful. I don't have much to say in response, but I'm still sort of developing this paper. I guess I really liked your question about how are the memories created and reproduced, sort of with the lack of an institution to kind of manage that reproduction. Mm-hmm. And I think that what's kind of interesting there is maybe the emphasis on kind of the practice of the memories, so like the act of not buying the sultans or checking kind of the country of origin of them, but also the emphasis that's sort of put on participation in the protests and demonstrations and that sort of thing. I think that becomes not just about kind of the protest and demonstration, but also about belonging to the community, belonging to the diaspora community, and that's sort of a way that it contributes to kind of the intractability of the conflict in Cyprus, because practicing the memory becomes part of the very identity of the diaspora community. And that's definitely something I'd like to explore further in the paper. And I guess as well, with the case of Cyprus, it's when the events unfolded, there was no kind of real telling that the moment of 1974 would become this really important moment for the Greek Cypriot community. And I guess that's really interesting as well, sort of why was that moment apprehended? And I think in Cyprus you can kind of see that because that was sort of, there was this moment of kind of conflict, of military action, and then it was halted by kind of the UN peacekeeping forces, and then it remained static for such a long time until 2004, where the only way to think about it was to think kind of there was this military action and then nothing, no real information about kind of what was going on in northern Cyprus for the people who were in southern or who were exiled in different countries or who were part of the diaspora in different countries. And so I guess I don't want to take up too much time right now, but you've definitely given me really useful things to think about, so thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks. Ayşe, thank you for the question. So I'm going to try and piece them together in one answer. So for Berguzino's question, I don't think that this is a Groundhog Day in... I like the idea of a slash horror Groundhog Day contribution to the study of cinema. I don't think it's Groundhog Day only because I don't think it's inevitable. There's nothing inevitable in the choice of Croatian and Serbian focus and fixation on these narratives. There are many, many more narratives of cooperation between Serbia and Croatia that could be chosen just as much. These are politically chosen questions of trauma and questions of conflict for political purposes, for differentiation between identities, for revving up political conflict, for revving up the otherness, and in that process of creating otherness, creating your own identity. So what can they do? They can do anything. They can change their textbooks so that they don't read the way that they read today. A lot of you know that I'm a diehard tennis fan, and my happiness about Marin Cilic's victory was greatly tempered by his celebration with Mark Perkovic-Thompson. He didn't have to do that. There's nothing inevitable about tying your Croatian national pride with somebody who denies the Holocaust and glorifies fascists. So these are choices that agents, I call them narrative entrepreneurs. Marin Cilic is a Croatian narrative entrepreneur today, as is Novak Djokovic in Serbia. These are all people who promote, these are the agents of narrative construction. So these are choices that all of them individually make that are not inevitable. I mean, people have analyzed, Dura Kostojanovic, who many of you know, has analyzed textbooks for years, and so have people like Damir Agicic and others in Croatia, where they have talked about the very selective uses of narratives that only focus on trauma, only focus on conflict, and only focus on kind of negative interactions between the two groups. There are many more from which to choose from. So I think that I'm going to pivot to what Ayşe was saying. I think you're absolutely right that there is something that a perpetrator of a kind of narrative discursive atrocity that gives the power to the victim and creates this victim, almost gives them a favor of sorts, like make this identity for them. And I think that sometimes I think that's intentional. Sometimes I think it kind of plays into a very receptive audience. And again, this is a choice that agents can make. So the other question was about the theory and kind of the causal power of narratives. And again, I'm going to tie that with Ayşe was saying about how can I argue that narratives are agents themselves and kind of without a person. they just kind of are. And I think that obviously that needs to be developed in something that's a little more convincing. But my understanding, the way kind of that I think about this, is that I'm not so much interested in the causality as in coercive power, like narrative makes something happens as if it's a person. I'm not interested in the personification of narrative. I'm more interested in the discursive space that a narrative creates that then makes actors imagine things that are possible and those that are not. So it's not in making you do something, it's making you think that something that you can do is possible and then foreclosing the opportunities of something else. So if there is causality, it's more in narratives creating identities of actors, and from these identities their preferences come from, and then they choose to act out of them. So it's more explaining the influence of narratives on political choices than causing political action. And I think I'm going to end here and let others finish.
Yeah, obviously thank you very much for the comments and questions. Some of them very difficult and challenging, which good questions always are. And maybe just to start by clarifying that you mentioned that you expected a more in-depth empirical analysis. Yes, it was not really the purpose of the article to present an empirical case study or comparative study. I sort of tried to draw from memory studies, philosophy and critical security studies, critical geopolitics, and to sort of present a theoretical toolbox, as it were, that can help us analyze contemporary security issues. Another question which I find very interesting and very relevant is what is medieval? What do I consider medieval, or what do we consider as medieval? Of course, what we consider as medieval is considered medieval in our Western discourse, largely. And of course, other discourses are themselves analyzed through our own discourse. So there's a sort of a meta discourse. And also keeping that in mind, it's sometimes very difficult to know what is really the agency and what is the subject of analysis. So for instance, when ISIS, you mentioned, is ISIS borrowing from this conceptual toolbox? Are they sort of borrowing from different chronotypes? Are they the agency, or are they the subject of analysis? It's very difficult to say. Also, for instance, when you mentioned that the genocide is a term received from the international community, is it received from the international community, or is it also, are the states contributing this to the international community? We sometimes picture it as a unified actor with its own goals and policies and yeah, sometimes it's very difficult to say is it the state or the international community which is the agency here.
On the list, Mouritzen.
Yeah, thank you. I have 2 points. To Filip and Ayşe. The first one about, as Filip asked, can we do without them? Can we do without these analyses? And the answer, in my view, is that no, because we have them unconsciously, all of us, in our heads. So the thing we can do is that we can expose them to criticism, both in the public stage and we can and among decision makers behind closed doors, that they should expose one analogy to another, and also not forget the contemporary situation they are sitting in. Look, for instance, at the Ukraine civil war that we are having now. I mean, as Filip said, that there are two analogies in that one. There's both the Munich and there's the Guns of August, and well, but you have to reply that to those two that none of them are efficient, because we have an alliance involved, which is NATO, which is a unique alliance with Article 5, which is completely unique in the history of alliances, which has a credibility that is unique. And therefore, when you start discussing, when you hear in the media, you start discussing about the Baltic countries or Poland, who will be next, who will be attacked next time. I mean, that kind of discussion refers to a Munich analogy thinking, where you should see the unique thing about NATO and say, of course, Putin is not an idiot. He knows about Article 5. He will never attack those countries. So he will go on within his own sphere, so to speak. So again, always, if there's a medicine, it is to have more than one analogy, and also to look at the uniqueness of the contemporary situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we will have to close this panel now. If you have any further questions, you can continue with the discussion during the coffee break. We will reconvene 1:15 noon, so please be sharp. And I think that our panelists, as well as the keynote speaker, deserve a round of applause.